Welcome to our next lecture entitled Culture and Communication. This is going to be our introduction into linguistic anthropology. So to start off, here is a working definition of language. Language is a system of communication using arbitrary sounds or gestures that are put together in meaningful ways according to a set of rules. Now, this does seem like a complex definition, so let's break it down. A system of communication. A system means it is something that is organized, a series of working parts. The term communication means any transfer of information. Now, it gets a little bit tricky when I say using arbitrary sounds or gestures. Arbitrary is a term that means something that is inherently meaningless. Now, obviously, when we speak a language or we gesture to something, what we're saying has a meaning. What we're communicating has a meaning. But those meanings are not inherent to the words or gestures that we make. Instead, language and communication is something that is culturally constructed and culturally understood. That's why when we hear a language we don't understand, those terms and those sounds and phrases don't make any sense to us. However, given the language that we do speak, in this case I'm speaking English, the sounds and words and gestures that we put together are done so in a meaningful way. I talk to you in a series of words, a series of phrases, a series of sounds that make sense to you. And those follow a set of rules. And those rules are put together in a way that we can understand. If you look at the other part of this slide, we can see a contemporary map of the world. And these are the most common spoken languages all over. We can see some languages that are spoken in some parts of the world, but we can also see how language has diffused over time. Some parts of the world speak English, where English is not the native language. And we can also see parts of the world, Central and South America, where Spanish and Portuguese are the primary languages. These are not the historic primary languages of these parts of the world, but rather it shows the history of domination and colonization over hundreds of years. Language is most often spoken or is oral. All languages have some sort of body language or gestures, but some languages, like ASL, American Sign Language, is strictly gestural. And some languages have a written form, but not all. Writing is a relatively new human invention, a new human technology, and has only existed in the form we have now for about 6,000 years. Spoken language originated thousands of years before that, but we cannot determine exactly when the first Homo sapiens started to speak. Something you must know is that language is taught. It is part of enculturation. It is part of socialization. Language is not inherent. It is something that, from a very young age, the children are taught. Babies are taught a language. And over time, they develop the complexities and the nuances of the language that they are learning. Humans are the only living creatures on the planet that have complexities in language that can demonstrate symbolic thought. This is an image taken from an anthropology textbook. This is a family tree of Indo-European languages. All of these can be traced back to something called a proto-language. A proto-language is a language ancestral to several daughter languages. Our proto-language is Proto-Indo-European that was spoken more than 6,000 years ago. However, this language split into different dialects that then evolved into separate languages, such as Latin and German. Latin and German, as you may or may not know, are the roots to many modern daughter languages. Historical linguists study language over time. They study the history of language, and they study the roots of languages, and they track to see how languages have changed. This is a great video clip from the people over at Vsauce, in which they explain the history of the English language.
Hey, Vsauce Michael here, and today we're going to talk about this, what's happening right now, the English language. A language spoken by more than 1 billion people with many, many different accents, and according to last year's Harvard Google study, a language with more than 1 million words growing at a rate of 8,500 new words every single year. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Where did English begin? Well, for that answer, we're going to have to go all the way back to the year 400, and even earlier, to this little Germanic peninsula jutting off at an angle, inhabited by people who appropriately were called Angles. Now, these Angles began immigrating to an island named Britain. In fact, there were so many Angles there, you may as well have called it Angleland. Angleland. England. Before they had Latin characters, they wrote their language not in letters, but in what are known as runes. And everything was fine and dandy until 1066, when the Normans invaded and won. One of the neatest changes that still affects us today is the fact that this new Norman ruling class would refer to the meat they were served using their own words, like beef or pork. But the poor old Anglo-Saxons who had to tend to the animals still used their early Old English words, for instance, cow and pig. And to this day, that is why English is one of the very few languages on Earth that has a different name for the meat of an animal than the name of the animal it came from. English did this a lot. Borrow words from other languages and other people and just plop it right down into the English vocabulary. So see, English is really fun. Or should I say, fun is really English. That's right, unlike all of these borrowed words, the word fun can be traced all the way back to the Angles and the Proto-Germanic word fano, which referred to a piece of cloth or a rag. It eventually came to mean a piece of fabric, say a hoisted flag that flew in the breeze, and then it came to just mean anything that was high-flying or buoyant, you know, like fun stuff. Singling out which words in English were borrowed and which ones were originally Germanic can be a pretty fun exercise. For instance, supervise is derived from Latin, but oversee, that's straight up Germanic. Well, what would English sound like if we just got rid of all these words that didn't originally come from the Angles? Well, what you would have is what is known as Anglish. Anglish is really fun to read because it's not really a real language, it's just an exercise that we can do nowadays. My favorite is this passage explaining atomic theory. Of course, you can't call it atomic theory because, for instance, the word atom is Greek, meaning something that cannot be divided any further. So instead of using the word atom, writers will use words like uncleft. And instead of using a word like theory, they'll use a word like beholding. There's a link in the description to read all of Uncleft Beholding. But now let's talk about accents. We don't all speak English the same way, and as a confession, I'm gonna say I'm terrible at impressions, accents, dialects. I pretty much only ever talk like this. Luckily, I read the science, and young children are the best at picking up new accents, so I brought along my friend, Todd. Nicely done.
Thank you.
It's a classic Vsauce move. Now, Todd is from Barely Political and the Key of Awesome, and he is fantastic at accents.
Oh, grazie, Michael. Grazie.
I'm impressed every day, but here's a challenge for you. Are you ready?
Challenge.
I want you to do an impression of exactly how you think George Washington spoke.
Let me just picture him. I've seen him on the quarter before. I think he probably sounded like this. What's up, players? Y'all gonna vote for me? I ain't gonna take two terms. Just give me one shot, and I'm one and done, baby. You know what I'm saying? No, seriously, Father, I did not chop down that cherry tree, all right?
I like that. But you know what? There's no way to be wrong. Well, I mean, there are ways to be wrong, but we don't know the real answer because back at the time that America first became a country, the classic British accent didn't even exist yet.
I quite like the Queen's English. Yes.
That would be completely foreign to them. But here's what's really mind-blowing about what the British gave to America: Southern drawl. That's right. These people known as the Cavaliers came over to America before it was an actual independent country, and they brought things like the word y'all, snickerdoodle, varmint, and they brought the word axed instead of ask, and the word ain't, as well as emphasizing the first syllable of words like guitar, July, and police.
Man, I've taken a lot of heat from English people for being from Texas and all that, and they started it, didn't they?
But listen to this. The Bow language was a language spoken on an island off the coast of India, and then last year, this woman died. She was the final speaker of the language.
All I can think about is that lady trying to connect to people like, oh, let us share in the cultural joke. You know, the famous cultural joke of the Bow people.
Yes,
Everyone's
yes.
like, no,
it was probably quite lonely. Todd, modern English as we know it didn't really begin that long ago. Think of it this way. There's a time capsule buried here in New York that is not going to be opened until the year 6,939. By then, English itself may be completely different or possibly extinct, and so they actually included a drawing of the human mouth where they diagrammed out where you need to put your tongue to say the letters like we say them today.
And we only have to wait almost 5,000 years? What a bargain! How convenient for everyone!
Yeah, what are we going to do in the meantime?
Well, you can head over to my channel for some comedy stuff. We did an episode of Vsauce called Vsauce Unplugged.
There's a lot of neat information over there about the brain and language, some joking around, and I got to talk to Dale.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed that clip. I did cut it off at the end there, but feel free to check out the other channel that they mentioned, as well as some of the other content that Vsauce posts. Now let's take a look at the social and perceptual functions of language and how language operates in a social and psychological way. Language influences how we perceive things, which in turn influences our experience of the world. Our experiences help us to develop language, but our use of language also influences our experience. It really is a cycle of perception, experience, and understanding. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is an important hypothesis, also known as linguistic determinism. It was first developed and advanced by Edward Sapir in 1929, and then developed by Benjamin Whorf. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis argues that the structure of a language determines a native speaker's perception and categorization of experience. So language, by providing habitual grooves of expression, predisposes people to see the world in a certain way, so it guides their thinking and behavior. Sapir and Whorf argue that because of our language, we are all stuck in a way of perceiving the world only through the terms of our language. Language limits our perceptions of the world by only giving us access to certain modes of communication, words, knowledge, and beliefs to guide how we think. The next video clip will show us exactly how language can alter our behaviors.
In the 1930s, the linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf proposed what is now known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Whorf, influenced by his mentor Edward Sapir, theorized that the way we read, write, and speak could influence and even control the ways we think about the world, as well as our abilities and our behaviors. While the hypothesis has faced skepticism, it's been tested in numerous experiments over the years, and researchers have confirmed that our languages are sometimes associated with differing skill levels at certain tasks. One such example is telling apart colors. Our knowledge of the various colors might seem obvious, but some languages have no separate words for colors like blue and green. Instead, the same word is used for both colors, and this does affect people's ability to tell these colors apart. Speakers of the Zuni language consider orange and yellow to be the same, and they have a harder time telling apart shades of orange-yellow. The hypothesis is further supported by the directional skills of Australian Aboriginal speakers of the Kuuk-Taieri language. In Kuuk-Taieri, there are no terms for directions like left or right. Instead, this is described using north, south, east, and west. Therefore, speakers of the Kuuk-Taieri must remain constantly aware of their own directional orientation, in a way that English speakers are not. These people can tell which way they're facing at all times, even in unfamiliar buildings. Their language has required this since they learned to speak. Keith Chen, an economic professor at Yale, theorized that the influence of language could be even more far-reaching in its effects on our behavior. He recalled how, when talking about an uncle, the Chinese language requires speakers to specify their exact relationship, whereas the English language allows speakers to use the same word for any uncle. Unlike English speakers, the Chinese speakers would have to remember these precise differences. Chen suspected that certain features of languages could also shape how we think about and plan for the future. What if some of us had to remember the difference between the present and the future, but others didn't? This is an important distinction among many languages. Their grammar either requires us to tell the future apart from the present, or it doesn't. English is what's called a futured language. To talk about the future, we have to say, it will be cold tomorrow, rather than, it is cold today. We can't just say, it is cold tomorrow. But futureless languages like Finnish allow people to use constructions like, today be cold, or tomorrow be cold. They can say be cold about the present or the future. Chen predicted that when a language treats the present and future as the same, we might start acting like the future is no different from the present, and consider it to be just as important as the current moment. We might be willing to make trade-offs in the present for the benefit of our future. Conversely, if we see the future as something very separated and distant, we might be more inclined to disregard consequences. To test his theory, Chen gathered data from surveys spanning 76 developed and developing countries in 5 continents. He compared households with the same income, family structure, educational levels, and religious beliefs. They only differed in their language. His findings were astounding. Speakers of futured languages like English saved money only 69% as often as speakers of futureless languages like Finnish. The futureless speakers saw the future as equally important and valued saving up for the years ahead. Even when Chen controlled for a country's GDP, growth rates, interest rates, and unemployment, their language was the strongest predictor of saving or spending behavior. And futured speakers ultimately had 39% fewer retirement assets. These effects also weren't just cultural or regional. In countries where people speak both kinds of languages, the difference still remained. In Switzerland, where 3 languages are spoken, futured speakers still save money only 36% as often as their futureless neighbors. And on a national scale, countries with futureless languages saved 6% more of their GDP yearly. These patterns even extended to healthy and unhealthy habits. Futured language speakers were less likely to use condoms or birth control, 24% more likely to smoke, and 29% less likely to be physically active. They were also 13% more likely to be obese, incurring a number of additional health risks. For them, the burden of responsibility today wasn't worth the benefit of a better future. The impact of their choice is very real. People over 60 who smoke are at an 83% higher risk of death. Even those who smoke and then quit are 34% more likely to die. And an inactive lifestyle can be just as deadly. 1 out of every 10 deaths in the world occurs due to being sedentary. Like many respondents who spoke a futured language, these amount to 5.7 million deaths every year, the unexpected effect of something as simple as language. Chen's research showed that even seemingly insignificant features of our languages can have a massive impact on our health, our national prosperity, and the very way we live and die.
So these video clips about the English language and about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis lead us to your first written assignment. You are to read the classic ethnography Shakespeare in the Bush by Laura Bohannon. Of course, the reading can be found on the course website. Please read it carefully and make notes on the parts that you find to be interesting. As you're reading, I'm going to ask you to answer the following questions. You can answer the questions one by one, or you can write a paper, and within the paper, you should be answering these. So Laura Bohannon is confronted with a very interesting anthropological moment in which she is sitting with some elders and she attempts to explain Shakespeare's Hamlet. I want you to answer the questions, how does language influence our view of the world? So go back, re-listen to the part about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and connect it to your own life and experiences. With this next question, I want you to connect it directly with Laura Bohannon's essay. How can information be lost in translation? And a tag to that question is, what happens if a word does not exist? This next question is more generalized, but I do want you to connect it to the reading. Why is it important for anthropologists to learn the language of the people they study? And besides just the language, what else must they learn? The paper doesn't need to be very long, but I want you to write at least 2 sentences for each question. Enjoy the reading, and of course, have fun. Thanks again. See you soon.